All right, good afternoon and welcome everyone. It's 12 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started with our latest installment of our continuing discussion of race and racism in the United States. My name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner, and my pronouns are she and hers, and I have the privilege of being the dean at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. And before I turn it over to Dean Teasley, who's going to kick it off for us with some opening comments, I'd like to start by acknowledging that this land that I'm coming to you today, I'm in the Salt Lake Valley, is traditionally Indigenous land, and that we here at the University of Utah acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homeland. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So it seems particularly appropriate that we should be here today on this land to engage in this very important outreach activity. So I'm going to turn it over to Dean Teasley to introduce himself and to start us off with some introductory comments on today's book, which is Caste, the Origin of Our Discontents. So Dean Teasley.
Thank you, Dr. Kronk Warner, Dean Kronk Warner, or Elizabeth. We decided we'd just use first names. And so I'm Martell, you're Elizabeth, but thank you for that welcome and opening. I also want to say I'm Dean of the College of Social Work, and along with her statement on Native Americans, we also believe in engaging anti-racist practices in our research, scholarship, and community outreach. So I'm going to open up and talk about caste. It's this interesting Isabel Wilkerson, Howard University graduate. I'm a Howard University graduate. This is her second book, and both of them are prize books. I think the first one won a Pulitzer Prize, and this second one is on the New York Times Best Book Series. So look them up. In the Warmth of Other Suns, she, doing the research, she stumbles on this information about caste, which kept her curiosity. And so then she wrote this second book. And in the first book, Warmth of Another Sun, it was about that great migration from the South to the North for African Americans that took place probably somewhere between 1940 and 1960. And as I always like to say, as she said in the book, Black folk moved from the warmth to the cold. And I always say we move from the warmth to the cold to the cells, the jail cells, in our search for a home within our home. We believe this is home for us, but home has certain comforts. So my daughter's in college, and if she comes home and she goes to a room, she finds that that's a comfortable place. She doesn't feel like she'll be attacked if she goes to the store or any of these other things within inside of our home. And African Americans are just not quite there yet in terms of feeling comfort in this place that we call home, where certain things don't happen, and that we have the right to be human like any other group. So just wanted to start out making that statement. But she starts off, the book's kind of in three parts. First, she talks about some definitional pieces. Then she does a entire historical piece on the kind of origins of caste. And then she comes up to more modern times and how that's impacting us currently. And so first, and part of that, she talks about this kind of distinction between caste, class, and race. And basically, caste has been in the US for over 400 years. It really starts with the European Enlightenment and the movement to settler colonialism in North American continent. And race has been around that time, since that time too. So there was no real concept of whiteness prior to about the 16th century, that whites, and created this notion of whites, which meant and identified people with this sort of, let me see my definition here. It's this definition of universal norms of quality, and perhaps very powerful about how people look, goodness and innocence, and all things intellectual as well as good related to whiteness. And then dictionary definitions of blackness meant the antithesis of whiteness. And so in our day-to-day practice in racialized state here in America and around the world, we have this real binary between whites and blacks because of blackness representing the antithesis of whiteness. And a whole system has been set up on that. But basically, she talks about caste as being fixed and rather rigid, and race is rather fluid, and we can organize groups. And so we did that in this country, and it's done differently in other countries. So in this country, we have the one drop rule about race. So you have one drop of African blood in you, and somehow that makes you a non-white person, which is really a silly notion, but we do that as a part of this caste system. And caste is also about power, she says, resources and value assignment. And it sets people, and then within caste, within some countries, such as India, there are different levels within different levels of caste systems. You'd have to read the book to get a good understanding of that. But the challenge about race in North America, which we always know race as a social construct, but race really has something that logicians call existential import. That means that if it does exist, it has certain attributes. Best way I can describe that is a unicorn. So if a unicorn exists, it must have what? A horn. And so if people are black or white, then they have certain attributes. And black folks have certain types of features, in terms of their nose, the relationship, their eye orbit to their mouth, et cetera, et cetera. And those are the things that make black people black, as well as being docile, as well as being lascivious in terms of women, as well as having hypersexual activity amongst men. These were things set in stone in the 16th century that still pan out with us today. So it was a way in terms of racialized caste system in the United States of demonizing a group of people. And that was really very instrumental into who we are. And I don't think we really understand race that much sometimes. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a situation here that I read about some time ago, which was in the Oxford Dictionary of Law. And there was a case that started in the 1893. There was a case of Johnson versus Wildman. I'm not the lawyer, so I'm reading from a law dictionary. But it was a case of a breach of contract where a person had sold a slave. This is prior to the Civil War, sold a slave to another person, and the person wanted his money back. And he said there was a breach of contract. And here are the grievances of the person who bought the slave. And the slave's name was Charles. And this took place in South Carolina. And so here's a direct quote. So Weidman was the plaintiff. And it says, according to Weidman, Charles was everything that struck terror into a slaveholder's heart. He owned a dog, which was against the law. He was married, which was unrecognized by law. He tried to defend his wife's honor against white men. He not only acted as though he was equal to white men, he said he wished he was white, and he threatened white people with violence, and he refused to take whippings. Now, this was a slave. And so the buyer, Wilderman, said, look, this guy is broken. I can't have him being a slave. But it was one thing about the breach of contract. It was another thing for the South Carolina court to deal with this. And so for them, in their doctrine of white supremacy and the great chain of beings, a slave could not possibly have thought of these things or have this sense of agency. So how did he get with this? So what they did was they had someone who testified that basically said that the former owner actually was a drunkard, and that sometimes when he drunk, he talked to Charles. And so that's where Charles learned these things at. So that is where they came up with a rule called like master, like slave. And that was a way of explaining away the way Charles thought about these things. Now, Charles's notion of being that he wished he was white, I don't think he actually meant that his skin color needed to be white, but the power of whiteness. He basically says, I'll show you what to do with this. And in the narrative, Charles was a really difficult person to talk to, because if you talk to him, you would walk away kind of scratching your head because he would say a couple of things. But again, the high court said, hey, this guy couldn't have thought of this. So we have to create this law like master, like slave, so that we cannot show that he has agency. So that is the extent to which we wanted to go to in this country to make sure that people of African descent were denied agency. So that's really, really powerful. And my point also is that I don't really think we understand race that well within our country today. And so we really need an in-depth study of race. And it's one thing to go through history, starting in preschool through K through 12, about social studies and what happened historically within America. It's another thing to tell the full truth. So what happens, and it's really it's a big turnoff for Black folks if you think about it, because you don't come into being in American history, you come into being as a slave. So you just kind of spring up all of a sudden like a potato from the ground, and you exist from there, and you're in chains. Now, if I'm a little boy and I'm a little girl, I've got a problem with this in school in terms of the origins of ourselves. Or, you get that whole piece about people coming over doing the slave trade, but no real notion of who these people were prior to them coming to America. So in the book, she talks about meeting an African person who basically says, we're not Black people. And she says, why? And the person says, well, we're the Igbo or the Asante or the Ndinka or the Mandingo. That's who we are. We belong to these ethnic groups. That whole notion of skin color as a description of who we are as people, that is something invented in the American context. And still today, many people from the African continent have trouble dealing with this. So when they come from Africa, they find that the notion of who they are is based on their skin color more so than the tribal affiliation that they have. And this is very stressful, such to the point that medical experts and doctors have told us that the high infant mortality rate that we see amongst African American women, we don't see that from African women when they initially come from the continent, but after subsequent years of being here in America, that the rate for women of African descent from the African continent starts to parallel that of African American women. That is, the stress of being racialized in this country has a problem for many people of African descent, particularly in childbearing practices for people of African descent. And whether people knew this or not, if we dig deep in the literature on slavery, many women were sterile for a couple of years when they were brought to America. In other words, they could not reproduce. And whites had to learn certain things about dealing with Black women so that they could reproduce. But initially, many of them were very sterile because of the stress that came with being in America and being seen as a person of color, as we say it. And then there's the whole notion of whiteness, what whiteness means. And of course, we talked about what that meant, but the whole notion of not being white as a way of seeing ourselves has had profound impact. And so we're going to have to deal with the reckoning about whiteness as well as our historical knowledge. So what is needed in this country, partially, and I'll give away to Elizabeth, is not only studying our history, but the lessons from that history, which we haven't engaged in. So I'm reminded of a letter that Karl Marx wrote to Abraham Lincoln, whether we know it or not, or remember they were contemporaries. And basically he said, I know that the country had this real problem with the institution of slavery as you had it, but how did you kill 500,000 of each other? Which we know now that's about 750,000 of each other. In other words, why did people, that institution is one thing to debate about that, but people actually killed each other over maintaining this dehumanizing institution. And my point here is that America and American whites really have not reconciled with that, as well as there's other problems of why Blacks still exist that they do, because people say, well, why come you can't overcome slavery's gone. We've had civil rights acts, you can vote now, and most of the legal restrictions that we have are gone now. Well, is that really true if we look at what's happening with voting? And if we look at the conditions and the context that we see Black folks living in now. So one of the things she says in the book is that in terms of resources and wealth, it will take African Americans 288 years to catch up with the wealth of whites, and our Hispanic brothers and sisters 84 years to catch up with the wealth of whites. And so there's really no way that that wealth can be caught up. And as I've said before, no matter what we've done in this country in terms of race equity, African Americans own less than 2% of the wealth in this country. And I'm not even talking about the deprivation that our Native American brothers and sisters have experienced. I'll stop right there and give way to Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Martell. I really appreciated your words. And I thought I would pick up, you mentioned that we haven't really come to terms with our history. And I think that's so incredibly true. So our history of slavery and racism and caste is not different from other countries. In fact, Isabel Wilkerson in her book does a great job of showing historical parallels. But what is different, I think, personally in the United States is our inability to come to terms with that and to move forward. So I thought that was a great point that you made that I just wanted to build on. So before I go into actually discussing the book, which I thought was fantastic, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, I highly encourage you to read it. I do want to acknowledge that this week we anticipate that we will get a decision in the Derek Chauvin case. You may recall that Derek Chauvin is the officer who is accused of murdering George Floyd. And this is really an important thing to acknowledge. For many of us in the community, the last several weeks have been incredibly difficult because watching this trial kind of come out and play out has been re-traumatizing, to be reminded of that. And then at the same time that this trial has been going on of this officer, we've also had another Black man who has been murdered, allegedly murdered. You will recall, you probably heard about Dante Wright. This is the case where it was a traffic stop and the officer allegedly mistook her gun for a taser, and instead of tasing him, shot and killed him. And then also in the past week or so, it's come to light, although the shooting or the murder happened a while ago, that Adam Toledo did not have a gun in his hands when he was shot and killed by police in Chicago. And that video, the body cam image from the police, has recently come to light. Really sad. I mean, they're all horrific, but this 13-year-old child who was shot and did not have a gun in his hands. So there have been numerous. I want to acknowledge that this week has just been really hard. And that's just been the past 2 weeks. And we are anticipating this decision in the Derek Chauvin case. And I've had a lot of conversation with my friends in the community about this case. And there are many of us who believe that there's a real possibility that he could be acquitted. And if he is acquitted, I anticipate that there will be race riots in the United States this week and moving on. And I think that's because anybody who's seen the video, it is an incredibly difficult video to watch because it is somebody losing their life, and it is very much present in our collective memory. And so the idea that the officer may be acquitted is incredibly, incredibly hard. And also a lot of us in the legal community, there's been a lot of conversation about how the prosecution in this case has been stellar. I have not read of any critiques of the prosecution could have been better in this regard or could have done this. And at the same time, I've read many critiques of the defense that the defense has not been particularly good. And yet there's this real possibility, many believe, that the officer, Derek Chauvin, could be acquitted. So why is that? And I think we have to dig a little bit deeper into that case. Now, of course, from the legal side of things, there's this discussion of qualified immunity and whether that should apply to police officers. And certainly there are legal issues to explore, and that's not the purpose of today's conversation. But I think there are also these race and racism conversations that we need to have. So part of the conversation, those of you who followed the trial, you know that there was kind of this discussion almost of whether or not he deserved it. Did George Floyd have drugs in his system? Had he not taken care care of himself? What was his behavior? So these whole line of questioning and issues that the prosecution really had to address in their case that suggests kind of implicitly at the bottom line, this assertion that, well, maybe he deserved to be killed. Maybe this was really his fault. Maybe this was really George Floyd's fault instead of the officer's fault, which is deeply problematic if you look and think about the questions implicit or the issues implicit in those questions. And I think go really nicely to Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste and how this is fully entrenched. Because I think if we think about if this had been a white man who had been put into a chokehold and had a knee put on his neck for, again, the alleged crime here was the use of a counterfeit $20 bill. I don't think anybody in the United States would think that a white man would be deserving of that level of force for that alleged crime of a counterfeit bill. Conversely, there's been a lot of that's been pointed out that, again, supposedly Dante Wright and Adam Toledo engaged in activity that was counter to agreeing to the police, and both of them ended up dead. At the same time, last week, there was a story that came out of a white man who fled from the police and rolled up an officer's arm in his window. And that white man was not shot. He was able to be arrested without injury to himself. And I think we can talk about numerous white men who have engaged in violent acts and have not been killed. So why is it that we see these different narratives and different results? And I think that we can really look to our recent developments and what quite possibly could be happening this week as evidence of this system of caste that she lays out and does just an excellent job of laying out. I was really struck at the beginning of the book. She starts off with this quote from James Baldwin that says, "Because even if I should speak, no one would believe me, and they would not believe me precisely because they know what I said is true." And that was just, it's such a heartbreaking and poignant statement. I know we've talked about James Baldwin before, but first we have to unwrap this idea that there's this real obstacle of belief. You see it again and again and again, that Americans in the dominant caste within the United States are constantly shocked to hear and learn about how bad things are in other communities. And we need to really work on believing one another and educating ourselves as to what's happening in other communities. Racism and violence have never gone away. I liked how she starts off, Isabel Wilkerson starts off the book with this analogy to anthrax. She gives this analogy to, I believe it was in Siberia, melting permafrost, and as a result of the melting permafrost, anthrax, which had long been dormant, was kind of bubbling up and was killing people again. And this is an analogy to racism in the United States. I think some people think that we've somehow moved beyond the system of caste or beyond racism, but especially they like to point to President Barack Obama as evidence of that. But we can only look to incidents just within this past week to show that that is in fact not the case, and that racism and caste still lies below the surface. I think she does a really nice job of explaining this and explaining, I like her analogy that America is an old house and we can never declare the work done because, and she also goes on to say that even if we did not build the house, it is ours. And that any further deterioration is in fact on our hands. And I thought that was, again, another really poignant point, because so often you'll hear the argument, well, I didn't participate in slavery, or I didn't participate in racist activities, and so therefore this isn't about me. Even if that's true, although I think we could certainly have a conversation about it. So for example, in my personal experience, even though I am Native, I'm a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, I am phenotypically white. And so when I go into society, I enjoy a certain status within the caste system, even though I technically have a different political association by virtue of being a member of a tribe. And so even though I have a different identity, how I'm seeing in society is going to give me certain benefits. And so I think that in and of itself is an interesting question of whether we can really say that we're not benefiting from these past caste systems. But even if we do want to say that, I think the fact is that we have inherited this system and we need to work to make it better and to dismantle it. And so I thought she had a really good point on that. I also appreciated her definition of caste. She points out at page 17, as Martell pointed out, she starts off with these definitions, and I just thought it was really helpful. Her definition of caste. So at page 17, she says, a caste system is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of another group on the basis of ancestry and often immutable traits. Traits that would be neutral in the abstract but are ascribed life and death meaning, again, so poignant today, given that we're waiting for this verdict, in a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste whose forebearers designed it. A caste system uses rigid, often arbitrary boundaries to keep the ranked groupings apart, distinct from one another, and then they're assigned to places. And again, Martell did a great job of explaining just how fluid race is, right? We know in the United States, who is white and who is Black has changed over time. There was a time period in our collective history when being Irish was not white, when being Italian was not white. There's been a lot of discussion over whether members of the Latinx community are white or not white. And so these definitions and constructions are indeed arbitrary based on the characteristics that Martell mentioned earlier. So she points out that caste is rigid while race is fluid. Race is a social construct and has changed over time. I love the fact that she keeps pointing to the fact that humans are 99.9% the same. 99.9% the same. And so these focuses on things like race, or she also has a good moment in the book where she said, well, what if we had this hierarchy based on height, and being a short person was the dominant caste and a tall person was not? What would that look like? And so I really thought she did a good job of teasing out just how arbitrary it is by kind of focusing on height differentials. But she goes on to explain and further identify the difference between the two at page 70, where I thought she did a really nice job of explaining caste versus race. Just get page 70. And she says here, explaining that what is the difference between racism and casteism? Because caste and race are interwoven in America, it can be hard to separate the two. Any action or institution that mocks, harms, assumes, or attaches inferiority or stereotype on the basis of a social construct of race can be considered racism. Any action or structure that seeks to limit, hold back, or put someone in a defined ranking seeks to keep someone in their place by elevating or denigrating that person on the basis of the perceived category can be seen as casteism. So she does a nice job of explaining that difference. I wanted to build a little bit on what Martell was saying regarding the difference between Africa and the United States, because his experiences are very much consistent with my own. I had the privilege of being a clerk in South Africa and living there for a period of time. And it was really fascinating because, as she points out, there are no Black people in South Africa. They all identified themselves based on whether they were Swahili or Xhosa, Zulu. They had their tribal affiliations, but nobody in South Africa said they were Black. And so when she said in the book, nobody is Black until they come to the United States, that really hit home from my own experiences. And similarly, nobody is white before they come to America. She talks about how part of the process of assimilation and citizenship in the United States is buying into this caste system and identifying yourself as white. And that means by putting down the lower caste or those that are considered Black. And I thought she had some really good points by that. That hostility towards people of color, the non-white people, became an initiation rite with citizenship. She mentions Alex de Tocqueville, who pointed out, quote, that the prejudice of race appears to be stronger in states that have abolished slavery than in those where it still exists. And nowhere is this so intolerant as in those states where servitude has never been known. And this is something that, again, going back to recent events that I wanted to tease out, this North-South divide. I think a lot of people somehow think that those of us who live in states or who live in the North, who either never had slavery or who abolished slavery, somehow live in a place of moral superiority. I know this was my experience. Before Utah, I lived in Kansas, and Kansas likes to still name itself the Free State because you may recall that there was the Kansas-Missouri divide over slavery, and that's certainly to be applauded historically. But that doesn't mean that there's an absence of caste or racism within the North or those states that didn't have slavery. And I think, again, we can only look to recent events. Where are these recent events happening? They're happening in the North. They're happening in Minnesota. They're happening in Wisconsin. These are violent events that are happening in states without the history of slavery or with a history of abolition. And so I really think Alex de Tocqueville's quote is alive and well today. We are not absolved simply because we did not hold slaves. It is still with us. It's still part of our caste, and it's still a poignant and potent part of the American identity. I've had privilege to talk to many colleagues who are Black and have talked about how they want to return to the South, because even though the South is racist, at least it is obvious racism and they know what they're dealing with, versus the racism of the North that still kind of percolates below, like that anthrax in Siberia. I also thought it was really poignant how she spoke to the fact that the bottom gear of our economy was torture, and the fact that slavery at its heart was torture. And we have to look at how has this been replaced in our society. So yes, true, we no longer technically have slavery, although you could make the argument that we have indentured servitude, people who are constantly put back into prison because they can't afford to pay fines. And we got to look and identify and look at our mass incarceration system, our system of law enforcement, police brutality. We need to look at these issues and really question whether or not it's true that torture is no longer part of American society. Is that true, or has it merely been replaced by other forms? And last, because I know I'm a little bit over my 15 minutes, I do want to say something that really struck me about the book that I think I knew somewhere in the back of my mind, but it was really good and helpful to read in the book, was this connection between the Nazis and the United States. And in her book, she goes in depth into three systems of caste. So she spends a lot of time talking about India, she spends a lot of time talking about the United States, and then she talks about the Nazi regime. And in the book, she does historical detailing of how the Nazis, when they were first starting to think about how they were going to legally set up their regime, looked to the United States for guidance. And that's really horrific. If you think about it, I would hope that we can all agree that the Nazi regime was one of the most horrible that has ever existed within the United States. But the fact that the Nazi regime specifically looked to United States and looked to United States because the US at the time was the leading racist jurisdiction should really cause you to pause. Our system, which is still intact in many ways, as it was in the 1930s and 1940s, was the template that the Nazis built their regime on. And in fact, as she points out in her book, the one drop rule that Martell mentioned was considered too harsh by the Nazis. They preferred that if you had Aryan blood, which is what they were focused on, that you could be redeemed by having that blood in your system. So I wanted to point that out because, again, I think I knew that somewhere in the recesses of my mind, but it was really brought home. She did a great job of drawing those parallels, and so impactful, and just recognition that all of us can continue to learn. And even if we know something, it's good to be reminded of facts, which I think goes to Martell's point about the importance of education and of constantly learning or relearning in my case. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Martell and potentially questions if we have any questions.
Excellent, Elizabeth. Just a little follow-up, and I know you remember because there's one statement by de Tocqueville that she mentions, well, there's several, but he says, only the surface of America is covered with democratic paint. And while I grew up most of my life thinking we were in a democracy, the earlier part of my life that we were in a democracy, we really don't achieve a democracy to the Civil Rights Act, where we let all people vote. And now we're in the process of suspending some of those rights. And so going back to Hitler and his looking around for a prototype of how he could demonize Jewish folks, he not only looks to the Americans, but also South Africa looks at America also. And whether people know this or not, that the South Africans actually bought the Nazi uniforms from them very cheaply. And so if you actually look at the white neo party in South Africa, the Afrikanos, in their uniforms, they looked just like Nazis because they bought those uniforms from them very cheap after World War II. The other thing is that Hitler basically thought, there's no problem with what I'm doing. They're doing this in America. There was a genocide in Armenia. So what are you talking about? It was only when the genocide that had happened in America, that had happened in Africa, but then when it happened on the European continent, that we rebelled against it. The same things had taken place in other areas. So in Africa and Tanzania, which is where people don't notice, Hitler perfected his gas chamber, first trying it out on Tanzanians, because if you remember your history correctly, Mussolini went to Tanzania because they couldn't feed themselves in Italy and said, this is going to be our breadbasket. Okay, and so Hitler was in agreement with that. They perfected the chamber prior to bringing it to Europe on people of Tanzanian descent who are Africans. And so this is huge, and we don't recognize any of this. We're not taught about any of this. So when she stumbles upon this in her book, I'm saying, yeah, I'm glad you're writing about this, because I've actually known about this sometimes in my own studies. You know, one of the real challenges here is the latter part of the book. She talks about a couple of things that, let me see where I have that at. She says, we're going to have this, the central question today, she says, is how we treat each other and our planet. And that reminds me of Mishra in his Age of Anger, which he says we're headed towards two clash. One, global civil war, and second, environmental degradation. And racism makes us, you know, we're so embedded and so intoxicated with race and racism that we don't see the larger picture. So one of the more embarrassing moments for me, or really downhearted moments for me, was the aftermath of January 6th. So it's one thing for that to happen in an attack on the Capitol and rebellion. It was another thing for our elected officials to basically minimize that and then make that parallel to what Black Lives Matter has been doing. Now, I don't agree with everything Black Lives Matter is doing, but they're not trying to overthrow the country. They were not talking about attacking the Capitol. They're basically saying, get the knee off of people's necks and stop shooting people within the streets. To see that, and please remember, audience, I'm a person who took the oath. I'm a military retiree. I've been to war for the country. And so when you go to war, you have to gather up the energy as you're starting to be deployed. Am I actually going to go through this? Okay. Am I actually going to get on this plane that's going to take me someplace where we're going to be in this conflict with these people and somebody may die? You go through all those things. And I went through them. And the one thing that kept sticking to my mind was that you took the oath. And so we have our elected officials who took the oath, who demonized it, who engaged in racial rhetoric that there's a part of our country that will listen to that, and got away from the real problems that we have. And so this is the problem of racism. It's not just sharks in the water, it is the water itself. I'll give way to you, Elizabeth, there.
Love that. It's not just the sharks in the water, it's the sharks themselves. So poignant. I just have one more comment and then I'll go to the first question in the chat. So again, just building on these parallels between these caste systems that she explores that Martell was pointing out. She makes this and what I think is very impactful parallel between the Germans in Nazi Germany who were living next to the concentration camps and would be regularly covered with the ashes of their fellow human beings, and how they would go into their home to avoid being covered in ashes, and how clearly they would have had to have known what was happening in the concentration camps. And she draws parallels to the lynchings in the United States, where people would give notice of lynchings happening and people would send postcards to one another with the tortured bodies hanging behind them, and really pointing out the impact of silence and how these atrocities were only really able to happen because society was silent, and how that enables this caste system. And I want to encourage us to think about modern day brutalities that are happening. And yes, hopefully people aren't taking pictures and sending postcards to one another, but we do forward these gruesome videos of brutality to one another. And are these modern day versions of lynchings and postcards that we like to think are in the history of the United States, but are alive and well today? And how can people see these videos and stay silent and really encourage ourselves? I know I personally have thought about in my lifetime, if I had been alive at the time of Nazi Germany, what would I have done in response? And I think she challenges us and asks us to say, well, are these atrocities still happening? How are they perhaps morphed in modern times? And are we being silent in the face of that? And so I think, again, especially given everything that's been happening in the last several months, that this is a really timely question to be asking ourselves. So we have a question, an education question that says, how could you see using the book Caste in undergraduate classes? What ideas do you have to provide more grassroots education to non-academic people about these issues? They are the ones who vote. So happy to get us started, and then I'm sure Martell will have some thoughts as well. So I think a lot of educational theory that tells you that you've really made an impact when you can get students to apply the reasoning. And so one way that I think you could use this book really nicely in undergraduate systems is going over the themes that we've been talking today and doing kind of the historical analysis and laying out, again, as Martell mentioned, she has the pillars of the caste system that she lays out, and you could go out and kind of explain and what those pillars are, but then ask the students to apply that to modern society. How are we seeing these pillars bear out? How are we seeing the sharks? As it were, as Martell's, how are they still alive? Because that's her point, right? Is that these systems are still in place. The caste systems are still with us. These events are still happening. They just look a little bit different in modern society. And so I would encourage you to use this book. I think it's an excellent book, and to think about how you can ask your students to apply these pillars and principles and historical knowledge to the present modern day. Martell, anything to add to that?
I would just agree with that, and just would say that there should be parallels between what you read in the book, and then you can ask students to say, you know, how does this exist today? What's going on? Or how's it gotten better? And one thing in studying history, because I went to a mainstream American school in Ohio, and I was given very little information about my own history. And so during college, I had to underline. It didn't mean that I stayed in college longer, but it meant that I underlined all of my studies with history. And part of that is studying different periods. And so when we're looking at different periods, and the one I studied the most was the post-Civil Civil War Reconstruction. It was just a big period I liked. But during different periods, 16th, 17th century, 1850s, whatever, what were different ethnic groups doing? What were their status? Okay. And when laws were enacted, how did it impact these different desperate groups? And that's a lot of work. But once you get an understanding of that, you'll get a better picture of how different groups were treated, how laws impacted people differently and differentially from one group to another, and who things impacted, who got the best deals out of particular laws, and who were the people kind of left holding the bag. So if we look at, say, for example, the start of Social Security during the Great Society, during the New Deal, what we find is that how did they leave African Americans out of it? The way they left them out was to say that people who are janitors and butlers and maids cannot collect Social Security. And those were the only jobs that African Americans could get at that time. And so you study different periods to understand how different groups were treated.
Yeah, and I was just thinking of one other example. Modern media and pop culture is replete with these examples. So just last night, my husband and I watched Kong versus Godzilla. I grew up a Godzilla fan, and it led to a really interesting conversation because King Kong, the original story, is exactly what Isabel Wilkerson is talking about, because King Kong is the manifestation of white society's fear of Black men. And, in the original King Kong story, right, he abducts a blonde-haired, fair woman. And so therefore he must be killed for having the gall to engage in any sort of relationship with a white woman, which she spends a lot of time talking about that. In fact, one of the pillars of caste is keeping the castes or the races separate. And so King Kong is a manifestation about that. That is what the original story is about. And so if you've seen the most recent movie, which it's okay, but in the most recent movie, Kong is the hero. And so it was this interesting conversation about whether these tremendously racist characters can be redeemed in modern society, or if we need to deal with the racism of the past. Similarly, if you're a Marvel fan right now, you might be following the Winter Soldier versus Falcon, and the fact that there's a lot of deep exploration going into whether a Black man can be the new Captain America, which I've really enjoyed that discussion. So there's a lot of opportunity here to not just, read a book and kind of talk about it, but also draw parallels to what's happening in pop culture. The second part of that question asked about, what about people who vote? What about grassroots education? I personally find a lot of times people say, well, we haven't benefited from these systems, so this isn't my problem. This is a Black person's problem. I didn't own slaves. My ancestors, a lot of people who are perhaps the descendants of immigrants like to say, I didn't participate in that. My ancestors didn't participate that. And I really like this framing it as caste, because even though that's true, and so for example, in my family, just going back to my own personal example, my mom's Native American. My dad is first generation American, from his parents were from Poland. So arguably my relatives did not participate in slavery, but yet because of my phenotypically light skin, I benefit from the caste system. And so I think that's a really helpful conversation to say that even if you didn't directly, or your ancestors didn't directly benefit from slavery or from genocide or from displacement of indigenous peoples, you're still benefiting from being part of the upper class or the upper caste system, which I thought was a really helpful way in shaping that conversation. Martell?
Well, here's a question: says, how does the caste system take people who would otherwise be allies and turn them against one another? I think immigration has a lot to do with that. The poor, we had that issue. Let's say if we take the 14th Amendment, and she talks about the slaver actually getting reparations instead of the enslaved in her book. One way they did that was through the 14th Amendment, which basically says you won't get any money for losing your slaves, but we are going to open up this Homestead Act and go west and have at it. Actually, it was full of Native Americans and our Hispanic brothers and sisters, and so they had to be killed off at that time also. And so we pitted people against each other. And right now, I wonder if I can share my screen for a moment, just for a second here. I'll move this way. So when we talk about pitting each other against each other, we actually think that the people coming through our border are taking our jobs, and that is the real problem. Our problem started in the 1970s when we started to ship our jobs overseas. So here we see productivity and hourly compensation. And we see productivity and compensation moving just along about each other until the 1970s, when we started to open up tariffs. And we see productivity goes up, but hourly compensation doesn't, it dwindles. And we have blamed other people for that, when it is actually the problem of our economy not preparing for shipping jobs overseas and not preparation for a high-tech society. There is nothing wrong with technology. It has done wonders for people, but we have not taken and prepared people for that. And you can go to any good university library and find studies knowing what was going to happen if we shipped the jobs overseas and did not prepare the populace for that. So now we're pitting each other against one another, and we're blaming it on the immigrants, saying they're taking our jobs, when that's really not what's happening.
Yes, absolutely. I when I taught at Texas Tech University, so many of my students were very much opposed to immigration policies because they really appreciated the Latinx population and worked cooperatively with the Latinx population. So it's interesting to see how this narrative spills out in different parts of the country. There's this other question that asks, how can white individuals know when to speak up as an ally versus when to stay quiet and let people of color share their voice? So this is personally a question that's kind of near and dear to my heart, because even though, again, I'm a tribal citizen, I am phenotypically white. People regularly confuse me for white. It's part of my identity. And so in many ways, I fill that space. And so one thing that I've been personally trying to do is trying to acknowledge what's going on and not asking my darker skinned colleagues to do that. So for example, I was on a meeting last week and just started off by acknowledging, I said, I am emotionally drained. This week has been horrific, with all the images of Black men being murdered, and the trial, the Derek Chauvin trial going on, which is just a daily reminder of what happened with George Floyd. This has been exhausting. I want to acknowledge that and create space for that. And if anybody else in this room is feeling the same and needs to talk, please do. And so I think it's really important that where those instances happen, to create space for it and not always rely on our people of color colleagues to do the same, because it is absolutely exhausting. And if you have to constantly be the moral compass for everybody else in the room, how can you possibly get done your work? So whenever there are opportunities, I try to be the one to voice and not expect my darker skinned colleagues to do the same. And similarly, I've worked to educate my colleagues and to try to encourage them to speak out about Native issues, that I don't always have to be the first person to speak out on Native issues, and that others can give voice and agency to those issues as well. And I think it kind of goes both ways. And then the question goes on to say, obviously don't want to silence people of color and allowing for people to share their voice. And for me, the line is acknowledging trauma and acknowledging recent events versus silencing someone's opinion. So I don't expect my fellow people of color to be the ones who have to always speak to trauma or what's happening either in our university community or nationally. I like to try to create space for that, but and it's something that I personally work on. But if somebody has an opinion, I'm going to try to amplify that and let them speak first rather than myself speaking first. And I think it's really important to always amplify and give words. So when Martell has a great idea, which he regularly does, saying, well, Martell's point on that is excellent, rather than saying this point is excellent, saying, well, no, that's Martell's point. And I think that's really a good way that white allies, or even allies in different spaces, right? So I am not Black. And so I'm an ally on those issues impacting the Black community. And so these are tactics that I can use as an ally as well.
So in the epilogue of the book, Isabel Wilkerson talks about empathy versus sympathy. And she says, sympathy is this great sorrow. We see a cat dead in the middle of the street and we have this real great sorrow. Somebody ran over the cat, or the cat ran in front of the car. But empathy is actually kind of putting yourself, not feeling sorry, but understanding and putting yourself inside the shoes of someone else and all the implications of what it's like to be racialized. In the everyday ordinary, at the end of the book, she talks about being on a plane and being racialized. She talks about being in a restaurant with a white person and not getting service, and the everyday ordinariness of this. And she talks about a good friend of hers that was in the restaurant with her, and they were denied service, and her friend blew up. And she says for herself, she couldn't do that every day because, and I experienced this myself, if you react to the everyday ordinary acts of racism that you experience, you'll be a very bitter person. And this could be very depressing. So for example, one day I went to get some coffee creamer at 6 a.m. and I was wearing a hoodie, and a policeman followed me to the store. And so when I got to work, I told other people about it because, it was rather off-putting. And they said, why don't you confront him? Well, for me, and if the cases that Elizabeth was talking about, I understand that the Grim Reaper is right around the corner. No one is thinking about dying when they do some of these things. So for me, it was, how can I get a person away from this person as fast as I can? Okay. And then if I'm in the store and I'm followed, if I'm in a clothing store or a mall and I get followed, which happens, depends on how I'm dressed, am I going to let that upset my entire day? And sometimes I need to confront these things. Sometimes I, let them go because of for my own mental health. Now, there's a question that says, how do you think about the effort towards reparations of systemic racism in Evanston, Illinois, in the Chicago area for beginning the healing process? I think that's excellent. I think the folks who can prove they were there when their community is redlined, as I understand it, will get about $25,000. Reparations can come in lots of ways. One is a real understanding of what was done. And I think America needs to do that. So if I do something against my wife and I say I'm sorry, that sorry is just the beginning of what I owe. Let's say I messed up our credit. It's a little bit more than that sorrow. It's, how do I repair? How do I show that I want to do it again? How do I do something about the financial harm that's caused and the emotional damage that's caused? And so right now, what we really need to realize, and the author starts with Baldwin's in the book, and he talks about being white too long and the damage that being white is done to our Anglo-American brothers and sisters. And so racism actually is damaging our country in general. We really had a very poor response to COVID-19. We're doing really a lot of very silly things based on race, shooting each other with guns. This whole notion of police just shooting before they even basically talk sometimes is rather ridiculous. And so we need to do something about the problems, the inequality in our school system. We need to do something about housing inequality. I talked about educational inequality. We have to do with occupational inequality and privilege based on that. Right now, we have a system where we know from a university study, a study out of the University of Chicago, that African-American names traded with Anglo-American names and resumes sent out to Fortune 500 companies, that the names of white folks on lesser tier higher educational institutions got called up first for the job, as opposed to Black folks who had their names on Ivy League visas. And we also know that a white male who has a prison sentence is more likely to get a job than a Black male who has just finished high school or also has a college degree. And so that's a real problem in our society. And we still have a long way to deal with this. So we dealt with a racialized society for about a quarter of a century. We've had freedom, so-called, for the past 60 years with the civil rights movement, and now we're rescinding many of those things. And so it's up for the majority to do something about it. It's not just what Blacks can do, but it's what whites as well as can do.
Yes. And I just want to echo, since Martell brought up redlining and the question brought up that issue of reparations in Evanston, Seattle's also doing this, FYI, and I agree with Martell that it's a great thing to look into. In Salt Lake City, we are not without historical fault for redlining. I put a link into the chat, and hopefully Gabby or someone can share that with everybody on Utah or on the YouTube. But I encourage you to check out this Mapping Inequality project. It's out of the University of Richmond. It has the maps for Utah. If you're not familiar with what redlining is, it's this concept that basically they used to draw a red line around the people of color in cities, and that's where they wouldn't extend any sort of benefits, insurance, mortgage, loans. And so if we look at those maps, and they would identify which communities should be invested in and which communities shouldn't be invested in, you will see that those are still the communities where we have environmental justice problems, for example. So if you go Mapping Inequality and you pull up the map for Utah, you will see that the best communities, quote unquote, the best communities, are exactly where you would still expect that to find them in Salt Lake City today. They're on the east side, on the benches, above the air pollution. And the worst communities, or the hazardous communities is actually what they call them, are on the west side, lower pollution area, closer to industrial areas where we have all the environmental justice problems. So it's a really poignant example of how these historical racist policies are still tracking us today. And here, for those of you who are in Salt Lake City, this is still absolutely alive and present. And they have it. It's not just Salt Lake City, it's a University of Richmond project. They have most of the major cities. They're working on doing all of the United States, most of the major cities done. I think they have pretty much anything to look at your town and see how the current environmental justice and racism overlaps with that historical redlining as well. So I believe that unfortunately we're out of time. I think these sessions are always too short. I feel like, Martell, I feel like we could talk all day about these issues. They just stay aware and predict COVID trial depending on what that verdict is. And I very much look forward to seeing you all in our next conversation. Any parting words?
Thank you. I don't know if it's her internet or mine that was messing up, but we will do this again. And please read the book. I think we do a good job here, but we don't do the total book justice. I think you'll find a lot in it, as well as some palatable solutions. Thank you for your time.